In Transition is a series not only because we are in transition, but foremost also because the photography, the medium of photography is in transition, and this since quite a time now. And we wanted to take this opportunity to have a look at the medium itself, and separately from exhibition themes, which we normally have when we have exhibitions, to really take the time to have a look at the medium itself and the changes it's going through, and the chances and possibilities and also problems coming from this. Tonight we are so very delighted to have Professor Fred Ritchin from New York here, who is a very one of the most significant experts and visionaries in this field. And I'm looking to my notes because his biography is quite long and I had to shorten it a little bit just to give you an idea. He is professor and associate chairperson of the Department of Photography and Imaging at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, where he also co-directs photography and human rights, the Photography and Human Rights program. He has curated numerous exhibitions and written for publications around the world. And among his books are In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution in Photography, which was published in 1990. Then the next one, After Photography, in 2008, which already had as a topic the digitalization and the changing of the media. And now, very recently, in the beginning of this summer, he was publishing the book Bending the Frame, Photojournalism, Documentary and the Citizen. In 1999, Fred Ritchin co-founded and became director of Pixel Press. He also served as the picture editor of New York Times magazine and was a founding director of the Photojournalism and Documentary Photography Educational Program at the International Center of Photography in New York. And now we are very happy to hear you enjoy the lecture.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you to everybody who made this possible. Can you hear me? It's okay? I got off an airplane, so I can't hear very well, so I'm gonna talk. So I was picture editor of the New York Times magazine until 1982, and when I was leaving, I was very, very frustrated by magazines and the way they use pictures, because it was like a formula that they did. That usually the pictures were used to illustrate the text. They didn't have a life of their own, and people made all kinds of arbitrary decisions in the way that they were used. And in 1982, the year I left, was the year that National Geographic moved the pyramids on its cover digitally, which to me is the beginning of the digital revolution. And that's when it started to happen, so that people realized that photographs were malleable. You could change them. When I started in publishing, I worked with a guy who wrote an entire book for Time Life, and he told me at the end of it he did not have one sentence intact, complete at the end of the book, because the editors changed every sentence that he wrote. So he wrote the book, but he had no complete sentence of his own in the book. So I switched to pictures, because I thought that if you pick a picture, you can't do that to the photograph. You can't go in it and change it the way you change commas or verbs or whatever it would be. You may reject a picture, you may write the wrong caption, but photographs seem safer. In the digital revolution, that's no longer true. My English is okay, you understand? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to show you various images having to do with this revolution. I think one of the most unfortunate things with the digital revolution is that more people don't participate in it. I think for the most part we think it's a revolution because they have all kinds of hardware and software that we can use, and we think it's a revolution, but basically we end up doing what the manufacturers tell us to do with all this stuff. But there's not that much resistance and pushback among people. Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian media theorist, had this idea that the fish are the last to know about the water. They don't know it's wet because they don't know what dry is. They have no perspective on the water. They don't know what dry is, so they don't know it's wet. I found, for example, when I published the After Photography book in 2008, I was invited to speak many places in the US, but never in a photography institution. It took 2.5 years for a photography institution to ask me to speak. The fish often don't know about the water. People in photography often don't know the changes. It's often the little sisters and brothers who are 14 years old who are not in photography who know how radically it's changed. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. So I'm going to show you some, and then we'll have time for discussion at the end. So I wrote the book After Photography in 2008, and Bending the Frame is a few months ago. This book is much more pragmatic and kind of trying to get, different ideas out there than the earlier. In the US, it all blew up this spring when the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper, which is around for about 150 years, and is one of the most important newspapers in the United States, fired all their photographers in one day. They fired the whole picture staff. They fired 28 people in one day. This is the second biggest newspaper in Chicago. And they decided to give iPhones to the reporters because they don't need photographers anymore. So it's happened to a certain extent in Malmo in Sweden, it's happened in the south of the US, it's happened in different parts of the world, this sort of sense that we don't need photographers anymore. And then the question is, why do they need photographers at this point? If 1 billion people have cell phone cameras out there, what does a photographer bring that the cell phone amateur doesn't bring, or the person with the iPhone? And you could think that's a very aggressive and insulting question, but when I've asked it at various conferences, professional photographers and editors have a hard time answering it. So that's kind of what I'll be talking about in part. So in 1984, I wrote this piece for the New York Times Magazine, which they gave an unfortunate title to, but this was 5-6 years before Photoshop. And I was concerned because there are machines like Cytex, which cost $500,000 at the time, which can take these things we didn't know, were called pixels, picture elements, which were new back then, and they could change things like the National Geographic cover that I mentioned before. And I was really worried 29 years ago that we would get to a point where nobody believed photographs anymore because they're too easy to change. And I thought we should do something about it. So I started with this photograph of New York City skyline for the New York Times Magazine in 1984. And then I switched it using a Cytex machine. In those days, you needed 2 weeks of training. It's like an airplane pilot with all the controls for a technician to know how to use it. And I stood next to him and told him what to do. So I brought in the Eiffel Tower, and I brought in the Transamerica Pyramid, and I brought in the Statue of Liberty. And I made a traffic jam in front of the Eiffel Tower because I thought a lot of people would want to see it. And I turned the top of the building around, and then I moved the Empire State Building uptown a few blocks, and so on and so forth. And I wanted people to see that it's so easy to do this with photography, and it's so undetectable. You see, the top of this building is not the same top of the building, and so on and so forth. It's so easy to do this because when I worked at the New York Times Magazine as picture editor, I think in the 3.5 years I was there, we tried to retouch color photographs 3 times. It took several days, it cost a fortune, and usually the results were terrible if you do it in a conventional way. But with this, it just seemed like so easy to do. And so the issue for me was credibility. If people begin to understand that this can so easily be done, how are people going to receive photographs? In some way, it's very good to be skeptical of photographs. In some way, it's really good not to trust them. But it's also power relationships. If there are poor people undergoing, let's say, a famine or a disease epidemic, you could say, I don't trust that photograph. Maybe there is no famine. Maybe there is no disease epidemic. It works in a power relationship that wealthier people versus the people who really need the help. You could always be skeptical. Skepticism is great, and it's a really good reason not to do anything. But if there's something credible about it, it's harder to ignore. So this was the cover. It was you can see it very well on the screen, but not here. There's camels here. This was a horizontal photograph in 1982, a horizontal with 2 pyramids next to each other. So they needed to fit it on the vertical cover. And National Geographic was like the most conservative publication. You could only use Kodachrome. No Ektachrome, no black and white. They wouldn't even look at your portfolio. So for them to do it was pretty amazing. And when I interviewed the editor-in-chief 2 years later, why did you do this? What he did was he rotated this pyramid behind this pyramid to get it to be more in the vertical, yeah? So I asked, why did you do it? He said, it's really nothing. All we did was go back in time and move the photographer a couple of meters to one side to get a different point of view. So they had time travel in 1982 in photography. You could go back in time and move the photographer one side or the other to get a different point of view. I said that to Edouard Bouba, the French street photographer, when he was probably in his early 70s, you know, that we can now do this. He's a black and white street photographer. You know, he's the one who waits for the girls with the flowers to cross in the rain with the taxi going this way and makes the picture, hiding behind the bushes and getting wet, that kind of guy. And he turned completely white because he said, you mean they could go back in time and change all my photographs? Because suddenly it appeared to him that photographs no longer are fixed at a moment. You could go back in time and change it in any way you want to change it. And I reassured him that they would never do that to black and white. So this is the first Future News photograph. This is 1994. This is Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, two American ice skaters who had a big conflict going to the Olympics. The boyfriend of one of them clubbed the other one in the leg so she couldn't skate. It was a very big deal back then. So with Tanya and Nancy, to me, did practice. This is the picture of the next day. They just obviously composited the people together and said, this is what it's going to look like tomorrow. So I thought it was really interesting that you could photograph the future in photography. And this was one of the top 10 newspapers in the US in 1994. And as you'll see later, I'm very interested in photographing the future in photography, but in more profound ways. And this was the one when people in the US and to some extent around the world began to understand it. O.J. Simpson, who was a big football player and celebrity and so on and so forth, was arrested on suspicion of a double murder in 1994. So Time magazine, they came out the same day, Newsweek and Time, took the police photograph by the Los Angeles police and changed it. They darkened it, they put it out of focus, they put a spotlight behind him. So there was, I think, 800 letters to Time magazine, 790 accused them of racism. Because they said when the guy is a celebrity, he's light-skinned, but when he's accused of double murder, you make him dark-skinned. There's something incredibly racist about that. So what Time magazine's editors said the next week is all we did, this is a direct quote, was take a common mugshot and raise it to the level of art with no sacrifice to truth. You get that in English, yeah? I mean, that's a profound statement. A common mugshot of one of the biggest celebrities in the United States arrested on double murder is common. And this is art. It's raised to the level of art with no sacrifice to truth in 1994. So you understand the concern about credibility. So this is this ran in Finland, 8 newspapers, a Swedish airplane crash. This is the first news photograph in history that was made without a photographer present and without a camera present. I was just sort of checking to make sure you're listening there, but. So what they did was they asked 3 eyewitnesses afterwards what happened, and then they composited it. And so later, this is 94, so later on they found a video of the scene, and it actually matched pretty well. So you remember Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton? So I always wanted them to do the same with Monica Lewinsky, like ask her what happened so we wouldn't spend 2 years like obsessing about what actually occurred with the president. But nobody ever took me up on that idea. So this was one, Lance Corporal Boudreau. He saved my dad and he rescued my sister. There's actually 2 Iraqi boys, one on either side the soldier. The picture is cropped, cut. And this one says, Lance Corporal Boudreau killed my dad and he knocked up my sister. He made her pregnant. So I called the Army because I wanted to know which one was true. It seemed to me a big difference. And they couldn't tell me. So I did a Freedom of Information Act in the US. It's an official government thing. And they said they did a 1-year investigation and they don't know which one is true. So there was a website where you could make your own poster with these guys. So it's you know, and then I asked, well, what, you know, could I talk to the guy? And they said, no, that's privacy. So then when I got upset about the Time magazine, O.J. Simpson, that I just showed you, the guy who did it, the art director, Matt Mehurin, said that's nothing. When Time magazine did Freud, I was a psychology major in university. It's a big deal to me, Freud. That's not Freud. In fact, that's Matt Mehurin, the art director, dressed up as Freud. You know, to me, this is sort of doing what Cindy Sherman did, like, you know, like, but not getting any credit for it. So this is, now I want to just talk a little bit about resistance to this. Like, I find it kind of amazing. It's like the goose that lays the golden egg. You know that story, right? There's a goose, and you don't want to kill the goose because then there'll be no more golden eggs. So the whole photography world, in Finland, they used the letter M for montage next to photographs that were montage. They were the first people in the world to do anything about it. But for the most part, not much has happened. In Sweden, the government created a website which is this picture of her as a cover girl. This is a fake cover. And then this image, this is actually what she looks like. And I don't have the time to show it now, but if you hit the hair, the breasts, the lips, the teeth, her breasts get bigger and smaller, her teeth get whiter, and it's a fantastic website. But the interesting thing to me is the only real resistance by governments to the issue of credibility has been in England and France over the issue of anorexia in girls. Because they think it's bad to show models too skinny who are fake, because then their daughters are going to want to be too skinny too. You know, it's not healthy. So on the issue of personal health, there's been some pushback. But on the issue of world, you know, believability, there's been very little. So in 1994, I led a group that tried to say, what's the most important thing about photography? It's the lens. It's not the camera, it's not the film or digital, it's not the photographer, it's the lens. Without the lens, it's not really taken from the visible reality. So we wanted to say, to put this symbol, not a lens, like a copyright symbol, next to any photograph that's been retouched or manipulated in significant ways. So that, like on the web, you could just click on it and find out how they manipulated it. I have nothing against manipulation. I think it's great, but you just have to tell people and not pretend that it's not happening. You know, anybody could manipulate it, it's fine. But nobody wanted to do it. Or almost nobody. So we get to the point when the United States kills Osama bin Laden. They've been searching for this guy, public enemy #1, for a long time, and they kill him. But they will not release a photograph of the dead man for two reasons. One, they don't want the Muslim world to get even more angry, the aspects of the people in it who might get angry. And number two, the White House or the government says, people won't believe it anyway, it's just a photograph. And we know that anybody could change a photograph. So we've gotten to a point now where you could kill the public enemy #1, and the government in the US is saying, it's just a photograph, they're not going to believe it. So what do we have left, in a way? That's essentially why I called the last book I wrote After Photography. Because photography was built on this sort of recording from visible reality. I'm not saying it's true, it's not true often. It's not even fair often, but it's a recording, just like a quotation of somebody's speech. You don't change the words around when you put quote marks. It was the same with the frame of a photograph. It's inside the frame, that's a quotation from visible reality, from visible appearance, let's put it that way. But we don't have that anymore. Photography is not that anymore. And some people, you know, think it's great too. So now we get like the World Press photo here, the guy who won the World Press photo, a funeral of Palestinian children in Gaza, which the lighting isn't so great here, but it became an enormous controversy because of the amount of retouching. It looks almost like Apocalypse Now, like a Hollywood film. It's almost like photography doesn't trust itself anymore just to report what's out there. It needs to dress itself up to become something else. This is the one that won more recently. And it's always interesting to me how few icons we use in photography over and over again, the mother and child, mother and child. And why use the mother and child in Yemen, a Muslim country? Why use a Christian symbol in it to win the World Press photo, for example? You know, it's remarkably lacking in imagination. Photography has reduced its vocabulary, it hasn't expanded it. So for example, the Pulitzer Prize winner in the United States is this picture in 2010 and this picture in 97. It's almost the same picture. You know, we don't, could you imagine in literature giving the same two novels the prize, you know, or things very similar? We don't expand the vocabulary very much. This one won the World Press Photo when the Israelis bombed Beirut a few years ago. And this was the caption, affluent Lebanese, you know, rich Lebanese drive down the street to look at a destroyed neighborhood. And they saw it and they said, we live there. The caption's completely wrong. We're not affluent, we're not tourists, we live there. You know, one woman in the back has her own cell phone, she's making a video. But they said, and what I found was really interesting is, of course the world press would think, you know, that we're tourists, that we don't live there, because they don't think war and bad things happen to anybody who looks like them. Yeah? So the vocabulary in photography, the kind of linguistic strategies, tend to be sort of 1930s driven. You know, Robert Capa, Dorothy Lang, the Farm Security Administration, those sorts of things. Particularly in the more journalistic documentary era. So we have Bush, mission accomplished. You know, so one of the questions between the amateur and the professional is, the professional gets a press pass. So they have the right to go places to photograph important people, but this is a lie. The mission was not accomplished. This was a setup. This was a year after the invasion of Iraq. So the professional could make the picture, but without asking the question, is the picture authentic? And I think that's one of the reasons that people are rejecting a lot of professional work at this point. It seems corporate, it seems stylized, it seems as if it's weighted to a certain point of view. Similarly, when Bush went on Thanksgiving, the American holiday, to Iraq, he picked up the display turkey, the one that makes it beautiful, not what they eat, and he held it up like he was the Godfather, you know, bringing the turkey. Great guy. At that time, though, the troops didn't have enough armor. They were getting blown up. Their trucks were getting blown up. He was not providing for them, but it was a great photo opportunity, and people fell into it. So photo opportunities begin to dominate. So a friend of mine was in Iraq a few months later, and this is the turkey that he was eating. It wasn't Thanksgiving, but it was it. So one of the suggestions I've made in many conferences is that you take the first picture and you put the second picture under it online. So with the mouse, the cursor, you go over and then you reverse the truth. For example, what made me think of it was when the Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, and so on were trying to have one of their peace conferences in the Sinai Desert near Eilat. The Americans spent $500,000 to air condition it so they wouldn't sweat for the cameras outdoors, because it wouldn't look good. It would look like they're not making progress. So I'd rather they give the $500,000 to build a school and do a second picture under it of the air conditioners. You would never do it again because you look like an idiot. But nobody ever shows the air conditioners. You know, I've talked to professionals working in Africa, for example, you know, surrounded by NGOs and their big, you know, SUV cars and stuff, and they refuse to show the SUV cars because Africa has to be exotic and so on. They don't want to show it. So this was the US invasion of Haiti in '94 for Aristide and Democracy. This is the front view, what magazines publish. This is the side view of the same scene. So why doesn't somebody use the second picture under the first picture and say it's a setup? Why does nobody ever do that? I mean, I've given this lecture many times, but nobody wants to do it. It's almost like they've got a secret, but they don't want to share it. You're with me? So we did Pixel Press in '99. So we did things like when the US was attacked in September 11, 2001, we were going to bomb Afghanistan because for some reason we thought if we bomb Afghanistan, it's a good revenge. I was in New York then, so I'm speaking out of, you know, I've lost people I know and things died, but why pick Afghanistan to bomb? It had nothing to do with September 11th. So we ran a picture, actually by Salgado, of Kabul in Afghanistan, which looked almost the same on our homepage. And we said, why bomb them if they're already bombed? What's the point? And all these like mainstream news publications linked to us, but they couldn't say it because it's not fair. It's not, you know, it's too political, it's too engaged, it's something. You can't do those sorts of things, but they could link to us at that time. And similarly, a year later, on September 11th, when the Pentagon was attacked in the US, Chile, September 11th, as you know, the Allende government was overthrown on September 11th, and I thought the two pictures were almost identical. So I was trying to say, you know, we're not the only people in the world who suffered. The Chileans suffer on the same day, and the US had something to do with that. So why don't we put it together? But people don't do this. I mean, Hartfield did it in the 30s. You know, the montage people have done it, but why can't news organizations and so on use imagery instead of saying mission accomplished, try to do things like this? So one of the suggestions was this famous photograph. The photographer hated this photograph, Eddie Adams. He thought it was unfair because he thought the guy was justified to do the killing, and he felt guilty to the end of his life that he ruined the life of the guy, the guy doing the shooting. He felt really bad, but it was the big anti-war photograph. But the photographer didn't agree with it. So I suggested, and I still suggest, that the four corners of the picture, you'd be able to roll over with the mouse here, and at the bottom right, you see the caption, the credit, and if it's been manipulated, and the bottom left, the photographer could tell you, or the witness could tell you what was really going on, give it context. And here he's saying, Eddie Adams, that he ruined the guy's life. And then the upper left, you'd be able to show the picture before and after, or video, or something else. And then the upper right, you know, you'd link to other sites. Because the point is, you know, again, McLuhan, he said we're all going at 150 kilometers an hour looking through the rear view mirror. You know, we think we're in the future, but we use photographs online the same way we use them in print. We put a caption on them. But why can't you, underneath it, because you know, the web has surfaces that the paper doesn't, can't you put other kinds of contextualizing information under it and around it? Okay, so the good news to me is that photography, the margins of photography are now the mainstream. In other words, I think that the mainstream is imploding. The mainstream doesn't work so well anymore. But there are a lot of really smart photographers who've done interesting work for decades that we can learn from. So Raymond Depardon, a French photographer, worked for Libération, the French daily newspaper, 30 days in New York, and on the foreign affairs page, Étranger, every day, he would run one photograph and a text. To me, this is like the first blog, but an interesting blog, you know, that was made 30 years ago or 35 years ago. The idea being this was Harlem and girls skipping rope. At that time in New York, you never saw a picture of anything good happening in Harlem. It was always murders and drugs. I remember Stern magazine at the same time ran a thing on the New York City subway system, which I took every day. It was 16 pages of beautiful color of murders in the New York City subway. You know, the blood on the aluminum walls, the red and the blood, it was beautiful. But I take the subway every day. I've never seen a murder. I don't know anybody who's seen a murder. You really have to find those murders. But if I was coming to New York, I would never take the subway on the basis of that. So he was showing something else, and then he would also write very personal things about his own life. Similarly, Telex Around by Gilles Perez, which he published after the Iranian Revolution, is a very kind of, it's an essay where he doesn't give answers on what's going on. He just asks questions about what's going on in photography. Like, I was picture editor of the New York Times Magazine. We ran it as a vision of Iran. It wasn't Iran what's happening, but a vision. Photography has a vision. It's not confirming ideas, it's a vision. And the ability to use the photograph to question rather than to answer was something that he introduced in a big way there. When we won the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Foreign Reporting, so I went in my tuxedo to receive the award. And on the way out, my editor said to me, the editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine, you know, neither me nor the top editor of the New York Times ever liked or ever understood that essay. You know, there was something about it, because it just didn't give answers, it gave questions. It did something different in what it was doing. So I had a student, I teach the photography and human rights program at NYU, so we get human rights students from around the world. I had an Egyptian student this year in the program, and she had done this project in Cairo during the Arab Spring. There were police sharpshooters who would purposefully shoot out the eyes of protesters with rubber bullets. They would aim at the eyes. And there was a guy who had his eyes shot out in the February demonstration, and then everybody started wearing eye patches in solidarity, and they put it on statues and so on. And then I think it was the October demonstration, they shot out his other eye, the police. So she worked on this project for 6 months. And for people in Cairo, this was really important, because this is their neighborhood. This is the people they know what happened. But she could find nobody in the international press who would publish it. Because the international press, there was a very good show in Berlin, actually, of all places. Open City, Cairo Open City, if anybody saw it. No? It was last year in Berlin in the fall, but it was people in Cairo organized it with people in Germany, and they showed the difference basically between the outside photographers photographed it. It was almost like the tank battles of World War II, like masses here and masses there and the big bridge and all that, and the people in Cairo photographed their neighbors. You know, it was a very, very different kind of photography, which gets us into the issue of social media. Because what I'm arguing for eventually is, you know, Web 1.0 is top-down web, like CNN. Web 2.0 is social media, horizontal web. And Web 3.0 is the so-called intelligent web that does everything for you. So I think the argument here has to be a kind of a hybrid between Web 1.0, you know, Stern magazine, and Web 2.0, the social media. How do you use them together? What do you do together? Like that. So in Tunisia, this was an incredibly important photograph. The man with the baguette standing up to the troops, but nobody knew it outside Tunisia. And there was a guy from Tunisia who spoke 2 years ago about the difference between a professional photographer and a member of the Arab Spring. He said the guys like him, members of the Arab Spring, cannot frame, because if you frame, the police see you and arrest you. So you just pick up your cell phone and you make it really quickly. You cannot frame. The professional can stand outside the group and frame because they won't be arrested. But if somebody gets shot or killed, the professional makes the picture and it's the front page. If the member of the Arab Spring sees somebody get shot or killed, they take him to the hospital. Then the picture has no use to them. They don't want to make the picture. They're not going to make the front page. They don't want the front page. They want the revolution. And if there's 450 people at the demonstration, the people in the Arab Spring would make it 800 or 1,000, so other people would join. And presumably the government or the police would make the 450 into 250 to show how weak they are. But you know, he was very clear on the difference. He was a computer programmer who photographed and who was arrested during the Tunisian Revolution. So a lot of the important photographs since the millennium come from amateurs. You know, in this case, soldiers in Abu Ghraib. It's not the professionals. And part of the reason, I think, is because the professionals photograph in a very repetitive, stylized way. They also photograph in a third-person way. It's happening to them. People in social media photograph, it's happening to us. And there's an enormous difference between them and us in terms of one's perspective. So this becomes a party picture, you know, done by US soldiers, which is torture, but it was their party. It was us. It wasn't them doing it. It was us doing it, which is enormously different. The same in Iran, Neto Sultan. And I curated a show a couple of years ago of a former student of mine at New York University who for 6 months photographed the Libyan revolution for the New York Times. And we did a panel discussion, and he showed all his pictures. And there's a Libyan student, 20 years old, on the panel with a headscarf. And I said to her, you know, you've seen all these pictures. You know, here's this guy, an American guy who goes to Libya for 6 months in the middle of the battle and so on. What do you think of all these photographs? And she said, well, first I want to thank the world for all the photographs, she said. And second, she said, there's one photograph that moved her. So we asked what? And she said it's an email photograph she received the day before of her father smiling for the first time in 40 years standing next to the dead body of Gaddafi. That was the one photograph that moved her, the social media photograph. All the professional stuff was meaningless to her. It was that photograph that moved her at that time. So what, well, actually I'm going to skip that one. What the New York Times is doing and other groups are beginning to do is try to take all these videos and photographs from Syria and crowdsource them. What do they mean? Authenticate them. Because we have too many images in the world. It's not that we don't have, we have so many images. Supposedly every 2 minutes we make as many photographs now as were made in the entire 19th century. In the last year, and the same number, 10% of all photographs ever made were made last year. We have so many images out there, but we don't know what to do them. We don't know how to filter them. We don't know how to curate them. So the argument I make in the Bending the Frame book is we need a meta-photography. We need people who know how to do that. We need Syrians to tell us what's important about Syria. We need people, you know, in different places of the world to tell us, or physicists to tell us which pictures we should look at. There's just so many out there. So what do? So there's several attempts, many, actually more and more attempts. This is one called Storyful. It's a group in England, young people who decided that's their business model, is they try to curate all this stuff. You could find their website from around the world and authenticate it. So the guy was describing how Hurricane Sandy, I think in New York, you know, somebody took this amazing picture of the tree in his backyard falling over in the hurricane, or one of our hurricanes. And they went to GPSs and satellite maps, and they verified that the tree was there before the hurricane, and then it wasn't there anymore, because so many people make up things in the images. But you have to be able to verify. When I did a panel on the future of photojournalism with picture editors, New York Times, and lots of important places, I asked them, what is the difference between a professional and an amateur? And the one thing they could come up with is that they have more confidence in the professional not to make it up. You know, but you could see mission accomplished and so on. It's not always merited. And the second thing they thought of later was that the long-form photo essay professionals are often better at than amateurs, which I'm not sure is true. So Susan Sontag, in her book Regarding the Pain of Others, the last book, in 2003, and to me it has a lot to do with Berlin, her statement, because my inspiration comes from here, was this is the only photograph in 2003 that she found that she considers anti-war. She says all war photographs are seductions to go to war. You know, glamour of war, the killing, the red, the explosions, and so on. This is the only one that she finds that's anti-war. Now, I was horrified. I'm still horrified. This picture sold $3.6 million at auction. It's by Jeff Wall, and it's called Dead Men Speak. It's actors pretending to be soldiers in Afghanistan that were photographed in Vancouver and digitally retouched. And Jeff Wall said, here, I didn't make dead troops to comment on the Afghan war. I made it because I wanted to do a picture of dead men conversing. It has nothing to do with the Afghan war. But she's found this is the only anti-war photograph. I thought that was pathetic. You know, with all these billions of images, this is the only image that she could come up with this anti-war. So I began to ask the question to myself, is she right about all that glamour stuff and so on? So I'm working on a project now, or thinking, called The Photography of Peace. Because if a 20-year-old student came up to somebody and said, I want to be a peace photographer, what do you tell them? It doesn't exist as a genre. If they say, I want to be a war photographer, there's thousands of books and exhibitions. You know, some war photographers will insist that they're anti-war photographers. But in the Bending the Frame, I write, at the end of the Iraq War, when the US was pulling out, there was a conference of two young and very talented photographers who photographed and made books there. And a woman in the audience who's Egyptian, she said, now that the war is ending, do you think all your pictures from the Iraq War, all the violence you showed and all that is going to help them make peace? You know, or are you going to look at those bloody pictures of your neighbors and want to kill them? You know, do you think about those things? Like, how are your pictures going to be useful for those people to make peace? And the photographers had no answer. It was incredible. One of them said, could you give us 5 or 10 minutes, we'll come back to you. You know, on a panel discussion, we'll come back to you. And then finally he said, that's a question for an academic. But how do you engage for years and years in a war without also thinking of peace? Or are you just using the people for good pictures? Or you really invest in the peace? And that's where the idea of a family album comes in. You don't just look in your family album, oh, that's my cousin, you know, who, you know, it's just a great picture of him falling off the house and breaking his 2 legs. That's your cousin. You don't say that. That's your cousin. He got hurt. It's easier to say that about somebody else. That's a great picture. But you can't say it about your cousin. So John Berger has this idea he wrote about, which is, during the Vietnam War, there was a Don McCullen photograph of a father with his bleeding child on his lap. It's a horrible picture, which probably you all know. And he asked the question, how could the Times of London publish that photograph and still be pro-war in their editorial policy? How can you see that pain and suffering and still engage in war? And his answer was basically, if you photograph it for the people in the picture, like a family album, there's something much more authentic about it. It's not the other anymore, it's us that are involved, that are engaged in it. It's a very, very different point of view at that time, and it's less easy to objectify. So this was Nina Berman's work. This was an assignment for People magazine, the celebrity magazine. This guy had multiple surgeries coming back from war. His high school girlfriend waited for him. This is their wedding day. You know, some people think that she looks in shock or anxious or whatever it is, but he's come back. He's missing his face, he's missing a lot of his features, he's missing his arm, or, you know, and so on and so forth. He's in incredible pain. And this was the wedding photograph. People magazine refused to publish it. So it was never published. World Press Photo gave it an award, and because it got the award, people knew the image. But what happened in the US with anti-war photography is that if you photograph those other people dying, it's the other people who die. But if you photograph us dying, it hits home more. And plus, you're not embedded. You don't have the problem of signing contracts. So a lot of war photographers, or what you might call war photographers in the interest of peace, are working domestically now. So she did a series of people with very, very severe imagery. It's called Purple Heart. And then Jennifer Carey did a series of veterans. She spends 1 month with each soldier in the US coming back, and she has them restage traumatic moments for them from the war. The reason is she wants them to live through it, work through it, but also so their neighbors and family know what they're going through. So this guy, when he hears a garbage truck make a certain noise, go over a bump, he thinks it's an IED from Iraq about to explode. So he hits the ground when he hears a garbage truck, because that's in his mind. And so she restaged it, you know, so people could feel it. It's not over there, it's over here. When she arrived in Iraq, she's a medic, they brought her right away to a woman lying there. It's hard to see in the slide. And the whole village said, you're an American, you should be able to save her, she's dying. And she's like 22 years old, and she walks over there and she's got to save somebody's life. And so now her mother and child are part of the restaging of what it means to go through that. And this is a guy, you know, when he drives, sometimes he stops for a tire and things because he still thinks it's going to be a bomb even if he's in the middle of the United States. You know, it's still in him. So people are deciding to do it different ways. This one is one of my favorites. It's by Monika Haller, this book, and it's on her friend Riley from college. He was a medic who went to Iraq with the goal of coming back normal after a year. He didn't succeed. He worked in Abu Ghraib prison. The ground was bloody from all the people who had been tortured previously. He had to walk on that. He saw a lot of things there. And so what she's been doing is working with him to reconstitute his photographs so he could remember things, because he's forgotten an enormous amount of it because of the trauma. So it's called Riley and His Story. And, you know, these are some of his photographs, and then he says things, pictures create a concrete reality. At least I know these things happen, they continue to serve that purpose. You don't know in the trauma, did it happen or didn't it happen? You know Sebald, right, Austerlitz and the novelist and so. It's very much about using photographs and trying to reconstitute something, because photographs do have a certain measure of credibility that other things don't have. Again, from Riley, we did a project at Pixel Press. Daylight Foundation gave, I think it was 8 cameras disposable to just like taxi drivers and dentists in Iraq to photograph their daily life. You know, this is, you know, the friends in the barber shop. This is the friend at college. This is the dentist. To me, this is the most important photograph about the Iraq War for me, personally, because with all the media coverage of the Iraq War, you never think people go to the dentist. All they do is blow each other up. And by showing people going to the dentist, to me, it becomes like they're people. It's not just they're crazy, you know, irrational people who just continually blow each other up. You know, it could be the most prosaic. We did this on Pixel Press. Brian Palmer went once a week, went to Iraq for 6 weeks, and once a week filed a story, a digital diary. So this is an American soldier playing with his Iraqi translator. Chess. Again, you don't see that in the media, but it's more the personal family album idea, and the Iraqi translator won. So Facebook took, Basetrack took this idea. They had 5 photographers with iPhones in Afghanistan, covering 1,000 Marines for about a year. And what they would do with the iPhones, it was just much more informal. They would make images. And these are like iPhone photographs of the soldiers. This is a guy who was arrested, and the families on Facebook would comment. You know, it continues the Facebook, enormous discussions. And it was interesting because the US military wanted them to do it, but then the families got so involved, you know, complaining, why do they have to wear brown socks on patrol? They're so uncomfortable, they should wear white socks, things like that. They closed it down because it just became too much questioning the military, what they're doing. But they saw it as a new form of kind of, you know, the family album, as opposed to them, it's us. So the New York Times, you know, does this memorial, all these little squares, if you roll over it, different soldiers' faces. These were all killed in Afghanistan, Iraq. It's a memorial that changes every week with the new people killed. You know, and you just go over it in every kind of pixel-like square and find out their hometown and their age and that sort of thing and do it. So there are lots and lots of ways of doing things with multimedia to expand the discussion. I'm not showing you multimedia just because of time, but a lot of these projects look a lot better not on a PowerPoint. This is Susan Meiseles' project. She photographed the Sandinista Revolution, 78, 79, the late 70s in Nicaragua. And what she's done is she's mounted her photographs from the war. She's mounted the photographs from the war and put them in the places where she photographed them. It's called Reframing History, so that the young people who don't know their own history can go to the actual places and look at the images of where she actually made the photographs, because she wants to give back. Again, it's not just photographing the war and making extraordinary pictures, but it's giving back to the people that way. Ariel Azulai, an Israeli artist, was doing a project on Palestinians and Israelis in the late 40s, and she really hates the dichotomies, you know, the easy dichotomies. So she was using United Nations photographs from that time at the beginning of the State of Israel, and she finds there's a lot more friendships and relationships between Palestinians and Jews at that time than because we make it black and white kind of thing. So she was going to do a show with the photographs, but the United Nations wouldn't let her do it because she was recontextualizing them, the captions. She was saying things about it that wasn't approved by the United Nations. So she took the step of drawing all the photographs so she could then say what she wants to say. You know, again, I'm trying to get at the idea of resistance, that you have to do it differently if what you're supposed to do doesn't make sense. So there are some photographers who really want to be useful. There's a chapter in the Bending the Frame, it's called The Useful Photographer. They just want to use the photographs to be helpful, to useful. So Gil Perez, the guy who did Telex Around, in Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia, Vukovar, makes photographs of for the forensic scientists, so the families can actually identify the members of their family who died or were killed in massacres and begin the grieving process. A lot of people now are doing that. We did together this website with Gilles and myself for the New York Times in 1996, after the peace treaty was formed between the Serbs, Muslims, and Croats in Bosnia, and it became like a hypertext, like a nonlinear narrative. It took 4 hours to go through, and the idea being we didn't want to tell like a bedtime story, what happened. We wanted people to have to investigate. If we have time today, it's online, I can show it to you. And they could go to any frame. They don't have to go in a linear way and jump around and figure it out. Because the point is that when the journalist goes, the journalist doesn't know what's happening. They arrive at the airport, where do they go? What do they do? And we wanted the reader to feel that as well, and to feel many, many other things with it. And we wanted, I went to the New York Times, the web was new. I said, since the web is new, why don't we do a photo essay about peace, not about war? Because it's a different way of looking at it. It's hard to make a peace. It was 4 years of conflict. So how hard is it to make a peace? What happens, we thought would be more constructive than showing just the making of war. Question Bridge, which is a fantastic project in the US, it's on Black American males. And for several years, they went around the country, these guys, and they asked Black American men, what questions you want to ask other Black American men? And they recorded it on video. So one guy would say, do you feel ever embarrassed eating fried chicken in front of white people? And then other guys would answer and said, that's nothing, I can't eat corn in front of white people. And then the guy says, why? And he says, because I'm gay and I'm black. I can't do either one. And these sort of discussions, like younger Black men were asking older men, where's the blueprint, for how to live, how to succeed? Why didn't you give us a blueprint? We want to know what to do. We're on, we have all these problems. And then older guys answer and they say, we gave you a blueprint, you just don't know where to look. It was an amazing, it goes on for 4 hours, this conversation. I learned personally, living in the US, more about what a lot of people feel through this than anything I've ever seen. And in terms of the Bosnia project, if I could have done that at that time and had Serbs, Croats, and Muslims ask each other on video, they would travel around with the video from person to person, why were you best man at my wedding and then you came and killed my wife? Why did you do that? And and then they answer each other. Maybe there's some healing that's possible to do that way. This is from that project. Okay, I'm gonna just a few more things. I have no idea if I talk too long or too short or whatever, but this is JR. So JR, the French artist. So he's doing a project again in usefulness. He's doing Women Are Heroes. So he thinks, particularly in a lot of poor countries, women sort of bear the brunt of a lot of physical work and are not respected for all that they do and who they are. So he makes these enormous photographs of women, this is in Kenya, who live in these very poor area. But then what he did, which I think is really brilliant, is he treats it with waterproof chemical material. So he puts it on the roof of their houses so they don't get rained on in the rainy season. So not only do they get celebrated as being heroes, but their houses are dry. It goes another step. It's not just the image there. And so when the train passes, the eyes match up with the faces. And he's done that in numerous countries. A few more from the more fine art side. There's several photographers who've done projects on death row. What's the last meal that people order to eat before they're killed, before they're executed? And what's amazing to me is how many people order hot dogs and soda, those sorts of things. And part of it is a class difference. Billionaires don't get executed very often in most societies. But part of it is also prisons only have a certain budget. We have $50 for your last meal, kind of thing. But to me, it's a very poetic, indirect way of getting at these issues of what people ask for. There's a famous case in Arkansas in the United States of a guy who had issues of intellectual development. And so I think it was a peach. No, he was going to eat half of the meal and he was going to eat half after the execution. You know, you're not supposed to execute people who are not have their cognitive facilities, but obviously that's not always the case. So this is, I'm sort of finishing up with a few images. This is a project on people kept in solitary confinement in the US and what these guys can't see outside because they're in solitary for many years. So there's volunteers who photograph their wishes. Like, I want to see my aunt's house. I want to see what it looks like outside the prison. And they've managed just recently, about 4 or 5 months ago, to close down one of the maximum security prisons because, you know, according to conventions of what humane treatment, they're inhumane. This is Ken Klisch. Beth on the left, her mother sent her out in Copenhagen. She wanted cigarettes and beer, and she became a prostitute to get her mother money for cigarettes and beer. And then on the right, she's 57. And so what he did was he gave her a camera, to photograph, to make a video of her own life, and he made a book of her. And her video, it's one of the most amazing videos I've ever seen. Won the Best Short Documentary Award in Denmark. You know, she's 57. It's horrible what she's been through. She's missing fingers, she's missing teeth, she has holes, she has all kinds of trauma, and she's standing there winning the Best Documentary Award with the video, the DVDs inside the book, and Kent, as the outsider who's worked with her for 30 years, his book of photographs won the Best Photo Book in Sweden. So the same book won Best Documentary Film and Best Photo Book. It's used by social workers. Bala Woods made this book on Iran. You're not allowed to publish it in Iran. So he released it as a free PDF. He does things like that all the time so that people in Iran could just download it for free and get by the censors. This is one in Geneva where people who have disabilities in terms of walking or wheelchairs use cell phones to tell each other, you know, which streets are hazardous. You can't go up the ramp or the steps or whatever it would be. So people are using media for themselves. This is Jim Baylog, his extreme ice survey. So what he's doing is he puts cameras at the glaciers that photograph like every hour, 30 minutes, all year round, so scientists can actually see what's going on in terms of global warming. You know, he's a very good photographer, but his idea really was just to help the scientists. This is a project I started to work on. These are future photographs. Remember the early one of the ice skaters? I want to show different parts of the world where scientists say what it's going to look like in 50 years, 20 years, 60 years if we don't do anything. Because I'm really interested in photographing the apocalypse so it does not happen. I'm much more interested in that than waiting for the apocalypse and then making good pictures of it. This is Chris Jordan in Midway, what's inside the birds that die because of all the trash in the ocean. Okay, and there's a bunch more, but I'm going to end with this because I've talked too much. But this is, you know, in 1968, Christmas Eve, this photograph was made from outer space. And this photograph was incredibly important. The Earth movement started because we suddenly realized that we live on the same planet, and the planet is fragile, so we should do something about it. So it was an amateur photograph made from outer space, but it was made in December of '68, and April of '70, the Earth Day, those things we do every year, started, and this whole idea of we have to worry about the planet. So photography at that point could evoke a worldwide sort of sense of, that's amazing and we have to do something. That's really pretty incredible. But now, the photograph doesn't have that same either iconic value, it doesn't have the same credibility. Everybody's making their own pictures, we're all authors, we all do whatever we want to do. I think it's a really hard way to run the world. Not that anybody runs it, but I use the analogy of like the captain of a ship, and there's an iceberg, and you don't want to be skeptical and discuss, is there an iceberg or not an iceberg? You want to be able to do something about it. But to do that, you need a communication system that people can rely on. You need to be able to talk to people you trust. You need to have information you trust. The fact that photography is now a matter of personal opinion, just like words, is fantastic, it's liberating. For artists, it's always been that way. But in the documentary realm, it allows for personal point of view. And lots of people are now included, so there's not just one version of history. There's multiple versions of history. But to me, the next step that we really have to figure out is how do you condense all that or filter all that in a transparent way that we could agree on so we kind of know what's going on in the world. It's again, it's easy for the people who feel more secure to ignore it because it's happening to other people all the time. But then how do you get it to the place where it's helpful? So one of the issues is, like the UN announced last year, I think it's 2019, they think there'll be no more front pages of newspapers, no more print newspapers. They'll be gone at that point. Maybe it's 2024 or whatever, but it's coming soon. So without a front page, without the ability to sit and to look and to share information, we don't know about the iceberg because there'll be millions of versions of it. Some people say it's there, some people say it's not there, some people don't care, we don't have a way of keeping it together. So in the aim of sort of liberating us as individuals, we have all these points of view, but we haven't figured out a coherent way to put it together. I did a show a couple of years ago in New York. It was only white walls in a gallery, and we invited people at different tables to sit down and say, on your front page, what would you put on your front page? Like, you come from this country, you know about that, you're a neuroscientist, you know about that, you're 14, you know about being 14, you're from Syria, and so on. What would you put on the front page? And then we just built the walls with everybody's front pages, like that. The idea was that if everybody would pay €3 a month, and we had like a rotating board of 30 people, who every month would tell us what to look at, what's important, the iceberg. We would have something to talk about in common. We would have to be able to pick them in some way. But with all those €3, if 1 million people joined it, we could be able to assign, all kinds of new projects for people to do interesting work. Like we think that somebody has to go and make oil paintings of the glaciers. We think this, we think that, we think we need to figure out schools, we want to give kids iPhones to document. We could do all this new stuff. My sense is, and really why I'm invested in it, is I really don't think it's anybody's place to tell you what's about to happen. But I think it's everybody's place to make it happen in our own ways, because we all have the tools of publishing, we all have the tools of production for the first time in history. This has never happened before. So, I think we're at that place in the world history which is pivotal. So I'm going to finish now with the very last things. Gideon Mendel had the idea, proactive. In Africa, people didn't want to give antiretroviral medicines to people because they thought Africans weren't disciplined enough to take the medicine. It wouldn't work. So what he did was to take a test case. He's originally South African, and this was a woman whose T-cell count was minimal. And then he followed her for 4 years, taking her antiretrovirals. I have an email from the United Nations AIDS, UNAIDS, saying that Gideon Mendel is a photographer. They calculate that he saved the lives of 8 million people by doing this project, which is pretty good for a single guy to get credit for 8 million people. Magnum, when they did Access to Life on people taking antiretrovirals with the Global Fund, I have the email the Global Fund sent them saying that your photographers, there are 8 or 9 photographers, are personally responsible for us raising $1 billion from governments around the world who went to the show, the website, and so on. There's this amazing speech I quote in the book from the ambassador from Japan saying he spent 40 minutes at their exhibition and Japan's contribution went from $200 to $400 million because of the images. So this was the days of the front page. This is what we have now. And just a couple of quick things. There's all kinds of innovations. This is Obscuricam. It comes out of Witness and The Guardian. And it's used now to photograph protests, political protests, so that the protesters don't get arrested by the government. It's an algorithm that obscures people's faces. It's irrevocable. You can't ever find it. Because in Iran, what they did was they crowdsourced the faces during the Green Revolution to find out who the protesters were so they could arrest them. So you can't really photograph otherwise. This is Momoto from Sweden, which is coming out very soon. It's a life logging camera, no buttons. It takes a picture every 30 seconds all day long. And there's an algorithm that supposedly picks out your most significant pictures for you. This is one of the pictures from Momoto. This is Ed coming out of Holland. It's 5 young women who believe that less is more, and they have all kinds of rules of how you're supposed to edit personal archives to reduce the size of them. And they have a book coming out just this week showing how this is done. So they're trying to come up with quasi-scientific principles on how you edit archives, and instead of having billions and billions and billions of images, how do you reduce it to a more useful thing? And this is my book. And the thing I put, the cover of the book is Michael Wolff. Do you know him? He's from Germany, but he's a photographer who's lived a lot in Hong Kong. And his Google Street Views, because he won a World Press Photo Award a couple years ago for photographing the screen of his computer through Google Street Views, because that's another form of documentary. Because you don't always, remember Robert Capa said if your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough? Well, there's an opposite argument, that sometimes you're too close. And things like Google Street Views, data visualization, there's another quote attributed to Papa George that if your pictures aren't good enough, you don't read enough, which I personally like too. Okay, so thank you very much.